Welcome to Season 4 of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, where yesterday's dinner is tomorrow's history. If you're a peckish person who is curious about the history of food and drink, then you're in the right place. I'm Sam Bilton, an author of some rather niche books who adores her history and food. And by the end of this podcast, I hope you'll be a fan of food history too. You can see what historical delicacies I'm cooking at the moment on Instagram, Threads or Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. In Season 4, we're going to be immersing ourselves in the fascinating world of fresh water, which as we all know is vital to life. We'll be journeying through the centuries to learn more about the food, drink and medicines water provides, its spiritual significance, discovering how water has been used to prepare and preserve our victuals, and how water has been utilised as a source of power and transportation for the food sector. Some of the topics will be obvious, but as ever, I hope that one or two will be pleasantly surprising. As with earlier seasons of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, the guests will be invited to bring a dish to the season's virtual potluck supper. And we've had some delicious contributions, I can tell you. The paid subscribers to the Comfortably Hungry Substack will also get access to recipes inspired by the topics covered in this season. I'm sitting at my desk flicking through my collection of 17th century cookbooks. Before you get too envious, they're mostly facsimile reprints or modern adaptations. I've just finished a thoroughly fascinating conversation with today's guest about carp, which you'll hear shortly. But as interesting as our talk was, it's left me a little puzzled. Because while the carp may well be one of the most widely distributed freshwater fish of all the British species, it is seldom eaten in this country. But as my little cookbook forage is revealing, this was not always the case. Take this recipe from Jervis Markham's The English Housewife, published in 1615. To bake a carp. After you have drawn, washed and scalded a fair large carp, season it with pepper, salt and nutmeg, and then put it in a coffin with good store of sweet butter, and then cast on raisins of the sun, the juice of lemons, and some slices of orange peels, and then sprinkling on a little vinegar, close it up and bake it. Some 50 or so years later, Robert May has an entire chapter in his book, The Accomplished Cook, devoted to carp cookery, offering recipes for stewing, hashing and roasting carp, plus plenty of other serving suggestions. And the carp continues to feature in 18th and 19th century cookbooks too. So why did the carp leap from the plate back into the pond to become arguably the most popular coarse fish in the UK? Let's hear from today's guest, John Langridge, an angler and author of many books on fishing, including Aphrodite's Carp, published in 2006. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Delighted to be here.
Now, first of all, before we get into the subject of carp, can you tell me a little about yourself and your interest in angling?
Yes. Well, I was born in Whitstable on the North Kent coast, and at the age of 4, my father made the mistake of taking me fishing for the first time in Whitstable Harbour. And my father caught several crabs and got very upset. And I caught an eel.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've been crab fishing before, but when I was a kid. Never took my kids, but never caught an eel.
And my father was using a proper rod and everything, and I was using a hand line, and he was more concerned about my falling in because there were no barriers or anything. But anyway, I caught an eel, and of course, I was hooked. Sorry to use that very obvious expression, but I was utterly hooked, and so I couldn't stop from there on. I was plaguing my father to take me. From that point onwards, to the extent that he says he's now 95 and doesn't go fishing anymore. But he says that I put him off it.
Oh, really?
Because I became so obsessed, and he was he was much more, easygoing about it than I was. So that's where it all began, really.
So we're going to talk about a specific kind of fish, and one I don't know very much about. Why is the carp so special?
It's probably, I don't know if this is a bit of an exaggeration, it's probably the world's most fished for fish. It's certainly the most fished for fish in Britain. Salmon and trout, of course, are very popular, but that's always been a slightly upmarket part of angling. What's called coarse fishing for ordinary fish that are not game fish, that is to say, they're not salmon species fish. I think there are 4.5 million anglers in Britain, registered with a license and so on. And I should think that 3/4 of them are what is called coarse anglers. They're coarse fishermen. And the number one fish they go for is the carp. So, that's one of the reasons it's important. And I myself have fished for it in Britain, everywhere in Europe, Australia, North America, Canada, South Africa. I've fished for the carp just about everywhere, and it is just about everywhere. So that makes it pretty important.
I believe there are some myths attached to it, or a particular myth, which is how you got the name of your book, Aphrodite's Carp. So could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, this is really important. When I first started the research on this book, I read in an encyclopedia somewhere that the carp was sacred to Venus and was brought to Britain by the Romans. And I thought, ooh, that's marvelous. I'll do some research and find out where and when and who by and everything. And of course, I found nothing. It's total fabrication. It's based on the work, I believe the chap was called Arthur Bryant. He was a Victorian historian. And as with many historians back in the day, they more or less made things up.
They did. No, they did.
And Arthur Bryant was extremely respected, but he made things up. And one of the things he made up was this. So my research quickly discovered that not only did the Romans not bring the carp to Britain, they didn't even know the carp existed.
Oh, wow.
No, it does not exist in any Latin text anywhere. And so this was really shocking. I got on to a person that I knew very well at Oxford, a lady called Samantha Shadd, wonderful woman for research into etymologies and so on, with the surname of a fish, which was a great help, of course. And we eventually found a reference to carp in classical Latin, which was dated 600 AD. So this is after the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths have invaded Rome, chucked all the Romans out and taken over. And it's a letter from a scribe, a chap called Cassiodorus, who writes to the kings of Ravenna in the north of Italy, saying that he's going to bring into Italy, for the first time ever, 2 exotic species, the salmon from the Rhine and the carp from the Danube. And this is the first time that the word carp appears in a Latin text. And so this proved beyond measure that the Romans hadn't got a clue. They didn't know anything about it at all. And so that was one myth busted. The next myth was that the fish was in Britain, which was not true, and was then cultivated by medieval monks in their stew ponds throughout the Middle Ages. I thought, oh, that's good. I'll go and investigate that. Nothing. Absolutely no evidence whatsoever. And so that turned out not to be true. Probably everybody that's listening will have done a bit of Chaucer at school. And in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer refers to the monk who had bream and pike in his stew pond. And that is what they cultivated. Carp did not exist in the medieval period in Britain. So those were the 2 myths that got busted.
Excellent. And I do like a bit of myth busting on this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
So you mentioned the Danube. Is that where carp originate from, or did they come to the Danube from somewhere else?
Yes, they are in fact native to the catchment areas of the Black Sea and the Caspian. So rivers like the Dnieper, the Volga, and the Danube, principally, are the native territory of the carp. Now, there is some controversy here. not about that information that I've given you, but how and when the carp extended east. I've caught this carp in China, and they exist right across Asia. They also occur in Japan. The koi, the multicolored, very pretty koi that people have in their ponds, is a carp. Not only is it a carp, but it's exactly the same species.
Ah.
It's bred specially for color, but it's the same animal, exactly the same animal. So there's some difficulty about when and how it appeared in the East. It may have always been there, but we're not sure. But the western edge was Hungarian foothills of the Alps. That's as far west as the natural distribution of the species existed. But things have changed since then, of course.
So how did it come to Britain, and or when do we think it finally made its way here? As something that was in a pond I'm talking about here, because I believe that it's possible we were importing them, I gather.
Definitely. And there is a man that we need to mention here, Professor Richard Hoffman of the University of York, Ontario, Canada. This man is the ultimate specialist in medieval economy, particularly as regards fish. And so his work basically proves that through the intervention of man, the carp gradually creeps across Europe from the east, from the lower Danube region, into Poland. A part of Poland, it may possibly have been native, but it gradually progressed further west and got into Britain, let's say, about 1500, between 1450 and 1500. And it was basically the English gentry keeping up with the Joneses or the Dijons of France, because it was fashionable in French stately homes and ponds and lakes and so on to have carp. Okay, because they're big, you can see them, you can hand feed them with bits of bread and so on. They were popular on the estates. And so the British aristocracy started to copy them. And that's why they came into Britain. It had absolutely nothing to do with food or fishing.
At this point, are they being kept a bit like you mentioned the koi carp that we have in ponds today? They were being kept for their decorative purposes, for want of a better description. It's almost like pets.
Absolutely.
Ah.
And the thing is, of course, Mother Nature gets excited when you, when you do something like this. And so when it rained and the lakes flooded and the rivers overflowed, and so the carp just traveled all over the country. There's a wonderful woman we should mention, Dame Juliana Berners. She was a prioress in St. Albans. And she wrote, although it's disputed, her authorship is disputed, but she wrote something called Fishing with an Angle, which is the earliest text about fishing in Britain, if not in the world. Now, unfortunately for us, she says carp are very rare in England. That's 1496, which makes sense, of course, because it's only then that they started to appear, perhaps 1450-ish. And so I felt it was important to mention her because that book is a wonder. It's an absolute marvel of a manuscript, available all over the places as a facsimile. But it's important to note that she says it's rare at that time, and that Chaucer says it, doesn't mention it at all. So somewhere between when Chaucer was writing and when she was writing, which is only a matter of 100 years, the fish appeared. One thing that Izaak Walton says, by the way, that I've now found the thing I wanted to say, that was 1653, Izaak Walton's book. And he says there, quoting somebody else, a chap called Baker, I think, that turkeys, carps, hops and beer all came into England in the same year. And the year he's referring to is roughly 1530 to 1550, scholars think. So it's just further evidence that the fish was not there in the medieval period, as if we needed it, but there it is.
From a cookery perspective, by the time we get to the mid to late 17th century,
yes,
you start to see a lot of recipes. I'm thinking particularly the one that springs to mind, Robert Mays, the accomplished cook. He has quite a number of recipes in his book. specifically for carp. So at some point, it obviously did make its way to the plate.
Yes, I mean, it was very cheap and easy to get. And of course, they're big.
Yeah.
You know, you get a pretty substantial amount of meat on your plate. However, it's pretty horrible, you know.
Is it? I was going to say, what does it taste like?
Mud.
Mud, okay. Okay, I have to admit that this was not the answer I was expecting. Frank Buckland described the carp as a water sheep, herbivorous, gregarious, of contented mind. So I'm thinking it would have a meaty texture and perhaps not be as fishy as other fish. But mud was certainly not where my mind was heading.
I had one in Prague. It's a very popular food fish in Eastern Europe.
Yes.
And it was tolerable. I think that's the most I could say. Carp recipes, probably that one is one of them, have very elaborate procedure before you actually cook the fish, to do with marinading and all this sort of thing, because the thing is so awful. If you go around a Chinese market, you'll see carp swimming around in tanks. Now, this is done very deliberately because they clean themselves. They're basically starved. They have them in tanks for at least a week before they are killed and prepared for the table, so that the mud flavour is taken away to some extent. You never really get rid of it.
Okay, I did not know that.
No, absolutely. I mean, in Eastern Europe, it is a hugely popular fish, and that is one of the reasons why we now have it in the fishmongers in England. It's a New Year's Day dish. It's a Christmas Day dish. The scales of the carp are kept as good luck charms for the new year. I mean, it's completely immersed in the culture of Eastern Europe.
I'd actually already discovered this when I spoke to Ukrainian food writer and activist Olya Hercules in the second episode of this season. Here's what she had to say about carp in Ukraine. I believe carp are found in the Dnieper River. So how is this fish used in Ukrainian cuisine, and when is it eaten? Is it like a festive thing?
Carp is eaten all over Ukraine. Well, wherever you get a river, definitely there will be, even more than one variety of carp. It's just teeming with carp everywhere. And Ukrainians are very used to eating freshwater fish. In fact, I grew up eating freshwater fish all the time. And my dad is actually a semi-professional fisherman.
Oh, wow.
He entered competition. He entered competitions and everything back in the day, like the Ukrainian competitions, fishing competitions. So he fished all the time. And carp can be a festive dish. Definitely during Christmas and before Christmas, you're not allowed to eat meat. But fish is kind of not considered as a meat in Ukraine, which is quite strange. But so, you are allowed to eat fish. And we would, bake carp, probably smothered in really well seasoned creme fraiche, smetana.
Oh, nice.
And then if you bake it, it gets this golden, beautiful crust. The way that we made it in the south of Ukraine was, so you fry it in a little bit of flour until it's really nice and crispy, and then actually you would cook it in a tomato sauce. So onions, tomatoes, a little bit of creme fraiche, smetana in the sauce as well. So you kind of braise it in the sauce afterwards. It's absolutely delicious. And so my dad caught it all the time, and my mom would probably cook it in the tomato sauce situation. That was or just fried, just chopped into things still on the bone, and then you just, very simple. Fish doesn't need much doing to it.
No. Not when it's nice, good fish, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So carp is huge. Not everybody loves it. Some people are like, oh my God, there's so many bones. I can't deal with it. But I didn't mind it. It's just come on, guys, just take the bones out. It's okay.
So do we know when we started to eat it then?
I think it's only opportunity. The fact that you have evidence from the 17th century is probably pretty early. I doubt there's anything before that. And then after that, there are certainly one or two recipes in the 18th and 19th centuries. You find the same in most of Western Europe, in France and so on. You also find recipes for carp. I think it's I'm going to say perhaps a recipe of desperation. If you're far from the sea and you can't get sea fish, and salmon and trout are too expensive, then you turn to carp as the best alternative.
It's interesting because I have heard it described as the pig of the river or the lake.
Absolutely. It spends its whole life with its nose shoved in the sediment. And so it just swallows buckets of mud. I mean, I expect you've had, sad to say though it is, I expect you've had salmon and trout from fish farms that taste a bit muddy as well, because they're not fresh run fish, they're not wild fish. And so they are living in comparatively muddy conditions. And that's why they taste like that. If you get a fresh run trout or sea trout or salmon, the difference is radical. The flavor of the fish is far superior if it's a wild fish.
I understand that they quick growing as carp as a breed.
Some have been bred especially to be quick growing.
The way you were explaining the flavor, I guess that explains why there hasn't been a bigger push. I believe so. Frank Buckland said something along the lines of he didn't understand why we weren't, sort of farming the waters for the carp.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I know that. Yes.
I have to ask this: are all sort of fish that are in freshwater sources? I'm thinking more ponds rather than rivers per se. They can't all taste muddy, can they? Some of them must taste good.
They pretty much do. The exceptions are pike and perch, because pike and perch are piscivorous. They eat fish.
Right.
And so they don't run around in the mud. However, having said that, I've also eaten pike in parts of Europe, in Switzerland, and it was good. Perch too, I've eaten in Switzerland, and it was good, better than carp, but still there's that slight muddiness. That is a problem with freshwater fish in general. And of course, you have to remember that salmon and trout, along with pike and perch, are piscivorous. They are fish eaters. And so, they don't tend to be rummaging around in muddy water. The problem with farmed fish is they're fed on pellets, which are muddy. The pellets themselves are muddy. And they are in an environment which is muddy compared with a fresh river. It's inevitable, really. I think it's inevitable.
Well, they're not that easy to get hold of. I have looked online.
In the London area, fishmongers, they've all got them, because of the influx of Eastern Europeans after, 2000?
Right. Yeah.
Yes. And so they're very popular. I've gone in and taken photographs of the slabs with carp on them, because, many of my friends are utterly horrified by the thought that people are killing carp. But they are farmed and taken to fishmongers. It's not as if, there is a lot of poaching that goes on, but they are actually farmed for the fishmonger market. So, there's nothing, generally speaking, there's nothing illegal going on there.
At what point does it become a sport as opposed to potentially something that was being reared as a foodstuff?
This is really a marvelous story. This is a chap called Donald Leaney. We're now into the 20th century. Donald Leaney worked for the Surrey Trout Farm in the 1920s, and they provided basically trout to various fisheries around the country, which was good business. But even though he wasn't interested in carp himself, he wasn't a carp fisherman or certainly didn't eat carp, he began to realize that there was a business opportunity. Carp would be very good for people's ponds for people to go and catch. And so he stocked lots of lakes and ponds around Britain with carp, which he imported from the Netherlands, which in turn had come from Poland, an area of Poland called Galicia. And Poland has a history of carp farming that goes back 1,000 years. And so the fish came from there to the Netherlands, and from the Netherlands into Britain. And Donald Leaney introduced these fish into various pools and lakes, particularly a pool which was called Bernathen Court Pool, which is on the Hereford-Worcester border. In the 1950s, 30 years later, there were rumors that there were monsters in this pond, because Donald Leaney knew what he was doing. He bought this particular species, this race, if you like, of carp, the Galician variety, because they were big. They grew to big sizes. And so, 1950 or 1951, Britain's most famous angler of the day, a chap called Richard Walker, a Cambridge chap, a mathematician, I think his origins were, and a trout fisherman, suddenly turned his attention to carp. And he goes to this pool and catches a monster of 44 pounds.
Crikey.
This is gigantic. I mean, it's absolutely gigantic. And this is the 1950s, when people since the 20s had already begun to believe that it wasn't possible to catch these things. They were too strong, too big. They smashed all your tackle and escaped and made a monkey out of you, basically. And so Richard Walker dedicated a good many years of his life to proving, with the technology of the day, he invented all sorts of stuff which is now common in usage, but he invented it all in order for people to be able to catch these monsters. However, it was 28 years before anybody caught one bigger than his. And that was 1981 or thereabouts, when Chris Yates, who is probably Britain's most famous carp angler today, caught a fish of 51.5 pounds. I mean, this is colossal. It's absolutely colossal. And so that record stood for a long time. It's subsequently been beaten, but it's still probably the most famous record of carp fishing. And so you can see that over the period I'm talking about, from the 20s through to the 1980s, the sport of fishing for carp absolutely exploded in Britain and is now massive.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a whole industry now.
So what sort of ingredients do they put in then to mitigate this muddiness?
In my book, there are a whole load of recipes, and all of them are pretty intense in terms of marinading and flavoring and so on and so forth. And the end product is surely very good. I'm sure it is, especially the recipes from Eastern Europe and from the Far East and so on. They really know what they're doing, and so they make a good dish of food from the carp.
All joking aside, John does explore some of the ways in which carp have been cooked over the centuries in his book, proving, I think, that people were happy to persevere in the eating of this fish. Robert May, who I mentioned earlier, has a good number of suggestions for how to cook carp. Stewing the fish with claret, spices, butter and slices of orange was a popular option, perhaps supporting John's theory that cooks were aiming to drown the flavour of the carp in other aromatics. In Kettner's Book of Table from 1877, E.S. Dallas suggests that the carp should be presented à la Chambord. That is to say that the whole fish should be skinned and the flesh larded with bacon, or eel or truffles on a fish day, and the cavity stuffed with veal forcemeat or quenelle of whiting. According to Dallas, the fish should then be placed in the fish kettle in a position of life, in other words, not on its side, before being stewed in white wine and some aromatic herbs and vegetables. He concludes his recipe thus: but it is always a point of honour to make the dish look well and give the carp à la Chambord a glorious retinue of good things. Glaze his head, diaper him with slices of truffle, and surround him in ordered masses with truffles, with crayfish and crayfish tails, with quenelles of whiting, and with regiments of soft roes furnished by himself and brethren of his tribe. Dallas insists that a large carp is necessary for this dish, differing somewhat from Victorian chef Alexis Soyer, who claimed that the biggest specimens were not good eating. So given the prevalence of carp recipes, were we actively breeding them for the table in Britain?
Historically, there was never any carp breeding, only accidentally. Nobody was actually setting about it, which was very much the case in Eastern Europe, where there were, whole networks of fish farming activities designed to produce the fish for the market. That makes much more sense when you think about it, because the access to the sea is considerably limited. And so freshwater fish were much more likely to be a food than they would be, for example, anywhere around the coasts of Western Europe or Britain. However, breeding in Britain, carp breeding in Britain, is probably at its peak now.
Okay.
Which is extraordinary. From the 1920s to the 2020s, carp breeding has become a thing. And so now there are fisheries in Britain that are breeding carp for angling purposes, and there are others, some of them being the same, who are breeding small carp for the table, i.e. for the fishmongers. So another thing I wanted to mention is about the business of scales on fish, especially carp. It's a particularly curious thing because the carp lends itself extraordinarily to genetic manipulation. When I say that, I don't mean it as a modern scientific phenomenon. I mean that if you put fish together and breed them, you get interesting products. One of which, of course, is the koi. People are often astounded when I tell them that the carp, the ordinary common carp, and the koi are exactly the same species. One's been bred for pretty colors and the other hasn't. It's astonishing. So early on in the carp breeding business in Eastern Europe, attempts were made to try to breed the carp without any scales, because scaling a fish for the kitchen table is a pain in the neck.
Yes, it is. I agree. I have done it several times in my life.
Absolutely. It's a ghastly business. And so these chaps tried to breed the fish without scales by putting, accidental fish with few scales together and so on. So very elementary genetic manipulation. And they were successful to some extent. But the consequences of all that experimenting are extraordinary. If you go to the fishing websites now, you will see references to leather carp, mirror carp, linear carp, mixed carp, and all sorts. And all of these fish are the same animal, but with different scaling patterns. Now, there's a beautiful word for this. I don't know if you're a word lover, as I am, but the word is squamation.
No, I do like that word, though.
Absolutely. Squamation is the scaling of a fish's flanks, basically. And so the mirror carp has very few huge scales, like pier glasses, on its flanks. And those are the ones that are kept for good luck charms in Eastern Europe for money, particularly, to do well in money in the coming year. The leather carp has no scales at all. It's, as it were, the success of the operation. The linear carp has one line of scales all the way along the lateral line, and so on. There are a few other varieties, some called the royal carp. The common carp, so-called, is the one that has the natural, complete, ordinary, normal scales. To me, when I was researching this, was mind-boggling. I ended up writing a chapter that's full of, complicated genetic tables, Punnett plans, and all sorts of things, because I was fascinated by how this happened.
Is the carp population being affected in any way by things like pollution and global warming in this country, I'm thinking of?
The short answer is no. The carp is one of the most resilient creatures that you'll ever find in water. They're very difficult to get rid of. In fact, Australia and most of the USA has been on a campaign to eradicate carp, which is invasive there, for decades, and they can't get rid of them. They're very, very difficult, very, very difficult to get rid of.
Is that because they eat other fish or other wildlife?
They do eat other fish occasionally, but they basically eat anything. They're completely omnivorous, and their oxygen requirement is relatively low. I mean, if you lift a salmon out of the water or a trout, you've really got to count the seconds because it could die right there in your hands. But a carp will stay alive for days and days out of water. There's a wonderful story in my book about a chap who sent some carp to the British Museum from Eastern Europe. He packed them up in boxes full of weed to keep them fresh. He put them in alive, thinking that they would be fresher when they got there. And when they arrived at the British Museum, 3/4 of them were still alive.
Wow. When was this?
1860s, I think. It took 8 or 10 days for the fish to get to Britain, and they were tipped into a tank, and 3/4 of them were still alive. In Asia, they are transported in wet sacks full of waterweed, fishweed, and they can be transported like that for days. And they're alive, and then you drop them into a pond and away they go.
Let's set aside for a moment the fact that the taste is maybe an acquired one. Do you think there would be ever a time when they would be seriously bred as a food, or as an alternative to, say, salmon?
Yeah, this is an interesting point. There have been attempts over the years to do exactly that, because for example, the price of salmon rockets or the price of other fish rockets, and they think, well, hang on a minute, we've got carp on our doorstep. Why don't we do something about that? And so I think it's a case of desperation. I'm sort of moving into the world of a sort of post-apocalyptic novel. If things got so bad that you had to eat fish from the local pond, then, people could definitely survive on carp.
Each episode, I invite my guests to bring a virtual dish to the season's potluck supper. Given that we're not living in a post-apocalyptic world, and what you've told us about the flavour of carp, I'm not entirely sure what to expect. So, John, what will you be bringing to the season's potluck supper?
This is described in my book as the ultimate carp recipe. Okay? And you need 1 carp of between 10 and 25 pounds, which is huge. So why that is, I don't know. 1 wooden board, 3 inches longer than the carp.
Okay. It's a big board as well, then.
You then need 2 large nails, 1 lemon, teaspoon of garlic, teaspoon of salt, teaspoon of black pepper, 1 cup of butter, 2 sprigs of parsley, 1 apple sliced and unsweetened. Okay, baking instructions. Preheat the oven to 400 degrees, clean and gut the carp. Rub the carp with butter and lemon, place the apple slices inside the carp, season with salt, pepper and garlic, center the carp on the board. Drive a nail into the head and the tail to secure the carp to the board. Place in an oven, set the timer for 35 minutes, then remove from oven and quickly remove the nails, garnish with parsley. Serving instructions. Throw the carp in the garbage and eat the board.
I just goes to confirm what you were saying about it being not worth eating. I have to say, this is the first time I've set out on a podcast and I've come away thinking perhaps I picked the wrong fish.
Maybe you made a terrible mistake. No, when I
should have gone with pike.
Yes, but I think this is fascinating. And if you happen to be in Prague, or anywhere really in Eastern Europe, you'll get a good dish served to you.
So where was that recipe from then?
No, this one was from a camping website in the United States.
So what's next on the horizon for you, apart from more fishing?
I've got a few things going on. This book...
The Spanish Barbel, yes?
Yes, that one has pretty much sold out in Britain. I don't know whether there'll be another edition. The demand for fishing books is quite small. My publisher always says the problem with fishing books is that most fishermen can't read.
I think that's being a little bit harsh, your publisher being a little bit harsh. Because if fishermen could read, there wouldn't be any business to be publishing books, would there? So,
and Britain, curiously enough, is absolutely the heaven of fishing books. It's incredible the number of fishing books that are published. So anyway, the reason I've shown you that is because this is the Spanish translation of that book. This is a sort of mock-up. It doesn't actually exist yet. And that is the next project. That should come out hopefully in March, April probably. And then in Britain, there's a book on the gilthead sea bream, which is extremely good eating. And that fish is popular all around southern Europe. But because of global warming, it is now found off the south coast of England. And so there are a bunch of people that are very keen on fishing for that fish in Britain. And so we're bringing out a book about the gilthead sea bream for the British market. I don't know when that'll be, the summer or the autumn this year, I should imagine. So those are the plans. Apart from traveling, I shall be off somewhere fishing before too long.
So are we seeing more, like the gilthead sea bream you've mentioned, are we seeing more Mediterranean fish coming into British waters as a result of global warming?
Over the years, even probably a couple of 100 years, the gilthead has turned up around the British coasts once in a blue moon, usually because of extremely warm weather. But now the sea temperatures have changed so much, the gilthead, the sea bream, has become pretty much resident around the British coasts, south coasts, I should say. And because of their habit of coming into brackish water, estuaries and so on, in the very warm months, in search of food, crabs and prawns and shrimps and things, then they are becoming a popular angling species. And you will see them appearing more and more in the world of cuisine. They're already there, but they're on the increase because it's a wonderful eating fish, one of the best sea fish for eating.
And what's a barbel like to eat? Is that as muddy as a carp?
Yeah, just the same as a carp. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. In fact, while I was writing about the barbel, I discovered that in several late medieval and early Renaissance texts, it's described as poisonous. But that is because of something in the organs. I'm not sure if it's the kidneys or the liver or something of the barbel are toxic. And so there is a danger there.
Right. Well, maybe I'll give that one a miss as well.
Yeah, give that one a miss.
Well, thank you very much for your time today and for being on the podcast.
It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it greatly.
And I've learned loads about the carp.
Yes.
I'm not going to lie, it didn't go down the road I thought it was going to go down, but that's absolutely fine.
Yes.
I will endeavour to get some because I'm now curious, even if it is muddy. So watch this space because I'm on the hunt for some carp to find out whether its flavour is as muddy as John says. You'll find links to John's books in the show notes, along with some of the other texts we've chatted about today. If you live in or around Gloucester, you can hear me talking about the true meaning of the food references in Shakespeare's plays at the town's History Festival on Saturday the 18th of April. It is a ticketed event, but you will get to sample some of the recipes from my latest book, Much Ado About Cooking. I'll pop a link to the event in the show notes. Next time on the Comfortably Hungry podcast, I'll be taking a trip north of the border to Scotland for a wee dram of whiskey, known in the past as the water of life. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you really loved it, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, as it really will help other listeners discover Comfortably Hungry. Don't forget to pop along to sambilton.com, where you'll find details on my books, which include my latest publication, Much Ado About Cooking, written in collaboration with Shakespeare's Globe. This new cookbook features recipes inspired by the food in the Bard plays and was huge fun to write, so I think it will be right up your street. You may also want to subscribe to the Comfortably Hungry Substack, which includes more detailed notes from the show. You can subscribe for free, but if you become a paid subscriber for £3.50 a month, you'll also get recipes inspired by the topics covered in the show and access to extra content. Alternatively, you can leave me a one-off tip via Ko-fi to show your appreciation. Just click on the relevant link in the show notes. Your support will help fund the research required to produce Comfortably Hungry. It also means that I can avoid including those pesky ads that may interfere with your enjoyment of the podcast. If you have any questions relating to this season's theme, you can leave a comment in the chat section of the Comfortably Hungry Substack page or tag me on social media. Remember, you can find me on Instagram, Threads and Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. I'll be plunging back into the liquid world of food and drink history soon, but until then, take care. Comfortably Hungry is research produced and presented by food historian Sam Bilton, with sound mixing and production by Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. Additional sound effects and music are provided by Zapsplat and Pom5.